Hello friends, this is Mike from Wright, and this is the explanations video for SAT 2's Writing and Language section, passage number 3, question 30. Now, this question comes at the end of this pretty long paragraph, and it is going to have a little bit to do with the substance of the paragraph, so I'm just going to summarize it real quick right here. This paragraph, the second one in the passage, is about linking otters and kelp and urchins and the whole cycle they're involved in to fighting global warming. They're sort of describing how otters and kelp work together to fight global warming. And that's this claim right here. How do they do it? Well, CO2 has been increasing, and we learned from question 26, the addition in question 26, that the increase in CO2 leads to global warming. So more CO2, the more global warming. And then these two dudes, Chris and James, they did a study that suggested that forests protected by sea otters, kelp forests with otters in them, absorb tons of CO2. So they're absorbing the CO2, and that fights global warming. And they do that because the otters eat the urchins normally eat the kelp. So whereas the kelp would normally not be able to absorb that much CO2 because it's getting eaten all the time by urchins, instead the otters are eating the urchins, protecting the kelp's absorbing tons of CO2. Now we get to this sentence here. Like their terrestrial plant cousins, actually we've answered 29 already. The answer to this is its. Like its terrestrial plant cousins, kelp removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, turning it into sugar fuel through photosynthesis and releases oxygen back into the air. This is just saying that kelp removes carbon dioxide. It absorbs carbon dioxide and releases oxygen back into the air. Okay? Now we're moving on to the sentence in which the question appears, and that's just right on the next page here. And it starts with this, scientists. Scientists knew this. They knew that kelp, what's the previous sentence? They knew that kelp removes carbon dioxide. They knew that, but they didn't recognize how large a role they played in helping kelp forests to significantly decrease the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. All right, now, whenever you see a question come up, like this in the middle of a writing section, you want to go find that question on the page and ask yourself for this question, looking at the different answer choices, is this a grammar question or a writing strategy question? In other words, do I have all the information I need to answer this question because all they're asking is how should we phrase this sentence? Or is it a writing strategy question where you need to understand more of the context in order to decide like what should we even say based on what the author's trying to say? Now this is kind of an interesting mix between the two. Looking at the differences between these answer choices, here they mostly differ, and here let's get specific. They differ in terms of the pronouns, that is to say, they differ in terms of these individual words that they're using. Here, answer choice A uses this word they, how large a role they played, and answer choice sort of D does the same thing. It's how large versus how large a role they played from A. This is that they played such a large role. These both use the word they. Here, answer choice B says how large a role it played, and so it's the difference between A and B is mostly in the A says they and B says it. And then C dispenses with pronouns altogether and just says sea otters, how large a role sea otters played. Okay? So this is kind of a grammar question in the sense that it's like we're really just deciding like what's the grammatically appropriate thing to do. But it has a little bit to do with the content as well, because the decision of which pronoun to use, should we be referring to they or it or sea otters, the decision of which of those we want to go with has to do with like which one do we actually want to refer to? Do we want to refer to scientists or kelp or otters or urchins, or like where are we trying to point? And that has to do with what the author's actually trying to say. So let's answer that question. Let's answer, what is the author trying to say? Where does the author actually want to point with this sentence? Let's reread it. Scientists knew this. The scientists knew that kelp removes carbon dioxide, but they did not recognize how large a role they played in helping kelp forests to significantly decrease the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Okay, so scientists didn't realize that something, and this is the something that the they or it or sea otters or whatever is pointing to. Scientists didn't realize that something plays a big role helping kelp forests to significantly decrease the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So really, and this is where this note comes in, we want to ask ourselves, what is the thing that we want to point to that plays a big role in helping kelp forests absorb carbon dioxide? Can we think of anything in the passage that helps kelp forests absorb carbon dioxide? The answer is yes. I mean, this whole passage is about otters. And otters are the thing that helps kelp forests out, right? They help kelp forests because they eat the urchins. So one way of approaching this question is to be like, all right, we need something that points to otters. And we're going to look at these answer choices A, and I mean all of them, through that lens of like, does this point to otters or does it point to something else? We'll go through like, well, so answer choice C is right because it does point to otters. But we're going to go through like why each of the other answer choices are wrong, not just because they don't point to otters, because they point to something else that doesn't make sense in that context. So let's go through answer choice A first. Here, scientists knew this but did not recognize how large a role they played in helping kelp forests to significantly decrease the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now the question for this answer choice is, where does the they point? Who are they? And are they the sea otters? Well, they here points to scientists. And this is true for a couple reasons. First, it's the nearest plural group of people. That is to say, scientists knew this. They knew that kelp removes carbon dioxide, but did not recognize how large a role they played in helping kelp forests. And here, they is plural. It refers to some group, as opposed to its, which is singular. They didn't realize how large a role it played. It is like one thing. They is like a group of things. And here, the nearest plural noun, the nearest plural thing that we're talking about, is this group of scientists right here. So here, the scientists knew that kelp removes carbon dioxide, but they didn't recognize how large a role they, the scientists, played in helping kelp forests to significantly decrease the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that doesn't make sense because it isn't scientists who are helping kelp forests to significantly decrease the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Nowhere in the passage have we talked about how like the scientists go scuba diving and like eat urchins themselves or whatever. It's not the scientists who are helping, and it certainly wouldn't make sense for the scientists to have not realized the fact that they play a role helping kelp forests. Right? So this answer choice is wrong, and actually here answer choice D is wrong for the same reasons. Sorry, I'll just point down here. Answer choice D is wrong for the same reasons that both answer choices A and D point to scientists as the they. Now you might be asking yourself, why can't we just assume that the they is sea otters? I mean, sea otters is a plural group as well, right? They, the sea otters, how large a role they played. And it really has to do with the linguistic cues, just how we've worded this paragraph so far. We haven't talked about sea otters for a long time, whereas we have talked about scientists more recently. So that's the group of people to whom the they is going to naturally refer. In fact, going back a little bit, going back to this previous paragraph, let's think about the last time we talked about sea otters. Well, we didn't talk about sea otters in that scientist sentence, and we haven't even talked about sea otters here. Here we're just talking about kelp. And the last time we talked about sea otters, in fact, we didn't even talk about sea otters directly up here. We were talking about kelp forests that are protected by sea otters. So there's even this other competing thing where, like, what's another they that plays a large role in protecting kelp forests? Well, it might be kelp forests, right? That's another they that the they could be referring to. So again, it's not at all clear just by saying they that you're talking about sea otters, and in fact, more specifically, it's much more likely if you're saying they that they is referring to these scientists, because that's the most recent group that we've been talking about. Now, the it works kind of similarly, although the it points to a slightly different thing, because it points out, it wants to point to the last singular object or subject that we've been talking about. Here, it wouldn't make sense to say, oh, it points to scientists, because scientists knew this, but did not recognize how large a role it played. It wouldn't be natural to say, like, oh, that the scientists are the it, because scientists is a group of people. You don't refer to them as an it. So we need to be referring to, it wants to be pointing to something else. And here it points to, like, the last singular thing we're talking about. Scientists knew this, that kelp removes carbon dioxide, but they didn't recognize how large a role it played. So let's go back and look for the it. The last it we were talking about here, and here we're just in this paragraph right here, like its terrestrial plant cousins, and here again I'm substituting the right answer here, like its terrestrial plant cousins, kelp removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, turning it into sugar fuel through photosynthesis, and kelp releases oxygen back into the air. So this is the most recent singular subject that we've been talking about, and this is what the it is going to refer to. We were just talking about stuff kelp does. Kelp does things. It removes carbon dioxide. Kelp releases oxygen. And so if we used the word it up here, we would be saying that scientists knew this, that kelp removes carbon dioxide, but they didn't recognize how large a role, and this is again B, they didn't recognize how large a role it played, kelp, they didn't recognize how large a role kelp played in helping kelp forests to significantly decrease the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, this doesn't make sense again because we don't want to be pointing to kelp. It doesn't make sense to say that kelp plays a role in helping kelp forests decrease the amount of carbon dioxide because it doesn't make sense to say that something is playing a role in helping itself. I mean, it's not like the kelp forest went out and read a self-help book and is like really trying to give itself credit for having its own back and being confident in its removal of carbon dioxide. That's not the point we're trying to make. We're trying to make a point about how something else comes in and helps the kelp. It's not the kelp helping itself. The it points to the kelp, so that's why it's wrong. And now here, this is really why answer choice C is right. Answer choice C is right because we haven't been talking about sea otters for a long time. We want to point to the sea otters specifically, and so in order to do that, we need to name them. We can't just say them, oh, you know which them I'm talking about, because your reader really does not know which them you're talking about. You could be talking about the scientists, you could be talking about kelp forests, right? So you really need to name them, the sea otters, specifically. Here, scientists knew this, but did not recognize how large a role sea otters played in helping kelp forests to significantly decrease the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, this makes sense because otters are the things that does play a role in helping kelp. And we need to name them by name instead of referring to them by them because we haven't talked about them in a long time. All right, that's all for this question. I'll see you all in the next video.